Hi, my name is Madison, and you are listening to Who's Knocking? Yet another true crime podcast. Welcome. I hope everybody is well. So I don't know if you know this, but I live in Toronto, and recently this city has just, I don't know what's going on. Well, I do. I think economic conditions are affecting everybody, but this city has been just a nightmare. There's violence everywhere. Our public transit has had stabbing after stabbing after stabbing. This morning, somebody off themselves, I think. My son's preschool teachers couldn't get to the school because there was some sort of dead body situation. There was a big hit and run near my parents' house recently. It's like Gotham City. And so I don't know if we're going to be getting a Batman or a Joker. Either would be cool, I think, though. Anyway, yeah, so that's the mood. I feel like it's dark and gray and just violent. So I don't know. Let's get into it. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a kind of a vigilante case, which I think is super, super interesting. And it just so happened that last night I watched John Q, which I'm sure you're aware of. It's a very classic 90s Denzel Washington movie. Fucking love Denzel. I will watch anything with Denzel in it. I love that man. And I always remember, I've seen that movie a million times. It's the one where his kid has this heart problem and he holds everybody hostage in the hospital to get the heart transplant for his son. And it's a vigilante kind of situation. So it kind of relates to this. But yeah, it was making me think about this case because I've been working on this case all week, obviously. And so it's been on my mind a lot. And I think it's really cool. It's a really fun case. And also John Q's, it is a good movie, but it has really cringy writing. But it's a good idea for a movie. And Denzel's in it, so it's awesome. Anyway, I think we'll just get into it and I'll stop talking. So today we're talking about Marianne Bachmeier is what I'm going to call her. This takes place in Germany. There's a lot of German names and German words, so please forgive me if you are German and I'm pronouncing things wrong. Please feel free to correct me because I'd love to learn. I didn't look up how to pronounce things, so I'm just going for it and seeing. So I'm going to call her Marianne Bachmeier, and that's what we're going to go with. So Marianne was born in Sarstedt, Germany, which, looking on a map, appears to be somewhat close to Hanover, which I feel I know I think it's a kind of a bigger city. I'm not exactly sure, but I've heard of it before. So if you've heard of Hanover, it's close to Hanover. Marianne's parents moved there before she was born, and they landed there as refugees after fleeing from East Prussia. Now, East Prussia no longer exists, but it was a former German province, which they lost after the Second World War. And mind you, this is 1950. I believe she's born in 1950. And so Germany lost this province after the Second World War, and it was divided between Poland and the former Soviet Union, now Russia. And at the time, the German citizens, I think they were forced to evacuate. I saw a lot of people say they chose to evacuate, but I'm pretty sure they were forced to evacuate and leave. People were not taking kindly to Germans at this time. Now, Marianne's father, and you'll see, was a member of the Waffen-SS, which is the combat branch of the Nazi Party. So he was a Nazi. Her father was a very, very religious man, very strict disciplinarian, did not seem like a super nice guy. He was literally a Nazi. So that sucks. And he also drank a lot after the war. And I imagine, although it's not explicitly said, but I imagine he developed a drinking problem during and after the war based on, everything that he saw and did. Remember, he is a Nazi. And so the alcohol really fueled him to be violent towards his family. And needless to say, Marianne did not have a pleasant childhood. Okay? Nazi alcoholic, violent father, that's not going to do you well. So her parents eventually separated, and her mother went on to remarry. But Marianne's new stepfather was not so great either. I don't know if he was a Nazi, but he was another very strict guy. He was very physically violent towards the family. And it seemed that the mother kind of took the side of the father because, shockingly, Marianne became a very difficult teen, which, I mean, her father's a Nazi, so I would be difficult too. But there was a lot of conflict between Marianne and her parents. And Marianne, she grew up to be kind of very free-spirited and like really rebelled against her family's conservative values. Remember, she grew up post-Second World War. She was like a teen of the 60s. I don't know exactly if like Germany had the same kind of hippie movement, but it seems based on the story that it kind of did, as you know, we experienced it in America and Canada and whatever. Things veered a lot more towards individualism and, you know, far less conservative family values, which her parents obviously subscribed to. They were a product of the Second World War and that whole lifestyle, and there was a big divide. So I'm sure this was a pretty common situation in her time and place, where like you had the parents who experienced World War II, and then you have their teenagers who didn't and who grew up in a very different time and era, and those were very opposing perspectives and worldviews, I suppose. Plus, you're a teenager, so you don't know anything and you think you know everything. And mind you, like, she had violent parents, so, you know, I'm sure she wasn't necessarily in the wrong here. But anyway, Marianne's mother eventually had enough of the fighting, and she went on to kick Marianne out of the family home when she was a teenager. So, again, very rough start, and her dad was a Nazi, so fuck. Although the victims of him being a Nazi, I'm sure, had it way worse. But I digress. So Marianne went on to become pregnant at age 16 when she was in high school. And she made the decision to go through with the pregnancy and then put the baby up for adoption. It's clear that Marianne had a very difficult time in high school. I mean, I don't know at what point she was kicked out of her house, but I think it was before the pregnancy. She spent a bunch of time in her high school years pregnant, and then postpartum, which I can tell you from experience is often much more difficult than the actual pregnancy portion of it, although she didn't have a baby. But still, mentally, that's insane. You think, you know, you see all these like teen pregnancy things, like, you know, there's like Teen Mom, the show, and I haven't seen an actual teen mom in a really long time, but, you know, that happens. And like, my God, I've had multiple children by now and multiple pregnancies. I cannot imagine the like hormonal aspect of being a teenager, which is already makes you super hormonal, and then being pregnant. That would be so fucking rough. And if you have experienced that, like, my God, I'm just saying, like, I never really thought about it until right now, but that would be just insane. So Marianne in high school, she really didn't have a whole lot of friends. She didn't get along with people that much. I'm sure she was kind of an outcast for being pregnant. I'm sure that doesn't make you a whole lot of friends in high school, especially with girls, which sucks. But she did have a boyfriend who I guess she got after she had her baby. And so she was very close with him. He was like, you know, her like confidant and the only person who really understood her. But then she got pregnant by him at age 18. And Marianne wasn't so quick to decide what to do with this pregnancy. She, I think, definitely had some guilt over the previous pregnancy, or the previous baby that she gave up. And so she was really deciding for a long time what she was going to do. And all the way up until very soon before she gave birth, it was actually days before her baby was due, this seems to have happened at a nightclub or a disco. And I don't know, I'm assuming that a disco in Europe is like a club, like a nightclub. Tell me if I'm wrong there, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is, because everyone describes it as she was at a disco and she was raped. So this is why I'm a little bit skeptical of this, is a 9 months pregnant girl at a club. One time I went for New Year's to this nightclub, which we ended up at when I was like 5 months pregnant. I did not want to go, but I ended up going, and it was brutal. I left crying. It was awful. Um, I just, and that's just me. Maybe some people are like really confident rocking their pregnancies at a nightclub. Me, not so much. But regardless, that to me just doesn't. I wanted to find some more context to that, but didn't. So yeah, she was apparently 9 months pregnant at a nightclub when she was raped. And after that, she decided to give the baby up for adoption again, her second baby. I think, that was a very traumatizing experience for her, obviously. And that whole experience led to the demise of the relationship she had with her boyfriend at the time. And that, was yet another trauma in her life. When she was finally finished with school, she started working as a waitress at a bar. And she was really enjoying this lifestyle. The bar was called Tipasa, and it was located in a city called Lubeck. And this was a beautiful city full of history. There's a lot of like old medieval architecture, and there's a high population of students. And I think most of them go to the University of Lübeck. So it's a student university town. And Tipasa, the bar, was patronized mostly by these students. And as typical students, there was a lot of like, they were really into like communism and philosophy and planning protests and stuff. And this was, again, the hippie era. So it was all like, very left-wing to the extreme students, as would make sense. And there was also, it seemed that the bar was home to a lot of kind of like outcasts, undesirables. Like it was kind of a down and out crowd as well as being a student crowd. But it was quite the community there, and everybody there, it seems like a kind of a big family type thing, at least the people who worked there. And I'm sure it was like tons and tons of regulars, students, everybody who wanted like some sort of revolution. Rah, rah, we're 18. You know how it is. Anyway, it was 1972, and Marianne got pregnant again. Now, this time she was a lot older, so she was like a full-grown woman. The father of this baby was a man named Christian Berthold, and he was the manager at Tipasa. And he and Marianne had some sort of like new age relationship. It was kind of on again, off again. This was a time where like I think it was a lot of like open relationships and hooking up and whatever. Now, this was Marianne's third pregnancy, and this time she really wanted to keep the baby. She had felt very guilty over the last 2 babies that she gave up, and she felt that she was ready to take on motherhood. So, good on ya. Christian, however, was not into the idea. He wanted nothing to do with the baby, and so the couple basically broke it off entirely, and Marianne accepted that she was going to be a single mother and decided she would raise the child on her own. But Marianne and Christian remained working together. Anna Bachmeier was born on November 14th, 1972. And Marianne and Anna, her daughter, lived quite an unconventional family life together. Marianne, now a single mother, continued to work at the bar. That was all, she didn't have skills to do anything else. So that's the job that she kept. And it was also the job that she really enjoyed and liked. She really liked the community aspect of the bar. She liked the people who worked there and who patronized the bar. Like that was her home. That was her world. That's what she was very good at. And so she thought nothing of, I'm sure she thought of, but she decided that's where she and her daughter were just going to live their lives. At Anna's birth, Marianne did have her tubes tied. She was like, this is going to be it for me. I've now had 3 babies. I've got 1 out of 3. I'm good. She did not want to have any more children. Now, Marianne welcomed her baby into her life, and little Anna was everything to her mother. Marianne was so excited to have her new baby. Everyone in Marianne's life was so excited to meet this new baby, all the people at the bar. It was a huge celebration. And I mean, who doesn't love a baby? Personally, I think that the creation of a new life, like the introduction of a brand new human being, is possibly the most exciting thing that could happen. It's the most interesting thing that can happen in your life, and it's amazing. This excitement and bliss did not last that long. Working at a bar and having a baby, as one could imagine, the two just don't mesh well. And Marianne began to struggle with balancing it all, unsurprisingly. I think women, especially single mothers, would struggle to balancing any sort of life, but this was particularly difficult, I think. Marianne needed to work as she was completely on her own, and she, needed to care for her daughter. She was a renter. She didn't have any formal education, I believe, and otherwise she'd be fucked. And although I say she was completely on her own, she was, but Christian, Anna's father, he still managed the bar, and from what I gather, he really didn't contribute to Anna's life in any meaningful way, but from time to time he would go on an outing with the girls, and they would go visit the countryside, and that was a really nice memory that they all shared. He cared about Anna, but didn't really help. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but remember, this is in the hippie era where, everything was non-traditional and everything was loosey-goosey and non-conformist and all this, hippie bullshit. And it was, in my opinion, kind of sounds like a great excuse for Christian to have his cake and eat it too. Or if you're a fan of the Unabomber, eat his cake and have it too. This was just a time in which you could, be really non-conforming, but in reality it's just, I'll hang out with the girl once in a while, but I will not contribute anything to her life. Kind of seems like a dick, but whatever. So Anna ended up spending the majority of her childhood at this bar. She would, she grew up in this bar as the only child in a bar full of adults. She and her mother lived in an apartment on top of the bar, so literally in the bar all the time. And this living arrangement was definitely pretty weird and not ideal. It meant that both of their lives revolved around the bar. And Anna would, for the most part, be kind of left to her own devices during the day. So I guess while she was a baby, she was just literally in the bar. And she often would just fall asleep at one of the tables, on one of the benches, and that's where she would stay. And Marianne would continue working into the night, and everyone was oh, she partied into the night. There's lots of descriptions of how Marianne was, and it's hard to say what the real truth was, right? Either she was, because it kind of goes from she really cared about her and worked at the bar and worked really hard for her daughter because that's the only work she had, versus it veers more toward she was partying and she kind of left Anna to her own devices. And I'm sure it falls kind of somewhere in the middle. I just don't know if it was more towards one way or the other. But regardless, Anna was, by all accounts, a generally happy child, and she was very outgoing and independent. Marianne kind of treated her like a little mini adult, which I think is pretty common when you have a single child raised by a single parent. Often the child is kind of forced into maturing faster and having a very independent personality. And I guess my guess would be that this was because their main role model, their mother, generally, is kind of forced to become a very independent person herself. And then you're also left with much less attention than a child with two parents would have. And I mean, hats off to all you single parents out there, because that sounds being a parent is a two-person job. So one person doing two people's jobs, that's crazy. I have 3 children, and parenthood is kicking my ass right now, and I have a lot of help. So it's not easy being a single parent. It's not, absolutely not shading. Just, I'm not trying to throw shade at all, obviously. This is just the situation that Marianne found herself in, and single parenthood must be intense. So the situation was okay for a while, but eventually Marianne did admit to herself this was not the best environment for her child, and she, was struggling. And Anna was now 7 years old, and it was at this time that she was like, I don't know, like how much longer we can do this. I'm sure she kind of felt trapped because it's like she had to keep working. So, man, that's why being a single parent is so hard. Because like, how do you like? You're working and trying to make money to like survive, and the only way to kind of get out of it maybe is to like go back to school and get some sort of degree or something. But how do you do that when you need to provide for your child? Anyway, but she was starting to talk to a married couple that she knew about possibly having them take in Anna for a while or fostering her on a temporary basis so that Marianne could maybe sort herself out or get some more traditional work. And this arrangement was in talks, but it never ended up materializing before what happened next happened. So on May 5th of 1980, Anna, who was now 7 years old and very independent, she was responsible for getting herself up and ready and to school while her mother slept off the evening's work. And Anna and her mother had an argument the day before on May 4th. And Anna was still upset about it. And it must have been pretty bad because as a 7-year-old, I guess you do kind of remember. I have a 4-year-old, almost 5-year-old now, and she would forget about that in 5 seconds. But I guess maybe by 7 years, and if you're already a little bit more mature, they had some sort of argument. Anna was still upset about it the next day, and she made the very unfortunate decision to skip school to spite her mother, apparently. And I don't think you can blame a 7-year-old for making this decision. 7-year-olds should not be left in the position to be able to make this decision. But regardless, that is what happened. And it appears that Anna got up, got ready for the day, but instead of making her way to school, she went to a friend's house, and she was going to ask that friend to skip school with her, but that friend had already gone to school. So Anna kind of wandered the streets, as she often did, chatting with locals and doing what she pleased. And Anna was very well known to her neighbors as a chatty, free-spirited child. She was it was not at all unusual for her to be on her own, as was common for many children in that day and age. As we know, parents used to just let their kids roam around cell phone-less and GPS free, and things were usually fine. But as we'll see, this situation is kind of one of those situations that led to that all coming to an end. Now, at some point, Marianne woke up, and I guess she assumed that Anna had gone to school like any other day. So for her, the fact that Anna was not there when she woke up was completely normal. But the day was not a normal one for Marianne. She actually had a photo shoot booked for later that day with a local paper. There was a journalist who had taken up an interest in Marianne because Marianne had a very unusual car. She had a Volkswagen, which I'm sure was very common in Germany, but it was covered in all these different paintings. Like, it was a very unusual looking car. So this journalist had contacted her and wanted to write an article about her, and so they were doing a photo shoot to accompany the article. Kind of cool. So Marianne went off to do that, and later when she got home and Anna should have been back from school, she noticed that Anna was not there. So she assumed that she was off with a friend and was still kind of upset from the previous day's argument, which I don't know what the argument was about, but like, it must have been pretty bad. So when it began to eventually get dark and Marianne still hadn't heard from her daughter, that's when she got worried and she went to the police. She'd called Anna's friends and tried to find out where she went, but nobody had seen Anna. And so she went to the police station, reported her daughter missing. They took that in and, made a missing persons report. And by the next day, there was still no sign of Anna. Marianne was obviously worried, but she was really hoping deep down that Anna was just doing this out of spite, that she was staying with a friend to purposely make her mother worried. And she did think that was a reasonable possibility, which, I would probably think too. But she did do the right thing. She put in a police report, so it wasn't like she was just sitting there waiting, right? But unfortunately, this was not at all the case, and it would not be long before somebody would come forward with information. It was that very afternoon, actually, that a woman came down to the police station with some awful, awful news. She told them that her 35-year-old fiancé, Klaus Grabowski, had confessed to the murder of Anna Bachmeier. Before I get into that, I think I'll tell you a little bit about the life of Klaus Grabowski. What is this asshole all about? Well, it seems that Grabowski was the local butcher/child sex predator. Seems like every town has one of those, don't they? I mean, why are there so many sexual predators among us? Why? What's in the water, you guys? I don't know. But Klaus's sexual offense history appears to have begun in the 1970s. At least that's when he kind of started getting caught. So I'm sure it extends much further back, but recorded offenses begin in the 1970s. His first documented offense was against a 6-year-old girl who, thank God, was able to get away. According to the records, he attempted to choke her from behind, but this very smart 6-year-old girl screamed her head off until he released her and she booked it. And that is exactly what you should do in a situation like that, and exactly what you should teach your children to do in a situation like that. But I don't know, don't take my advice. I'm just a random person, but I think you just have a much higher likelihood of getting out of a situation if you do scream and run. There's so many cases of kids or women who get kidnapped in a kind of a public setting, and they just freeze up and cooperate with the individual. Even if somebody has a gun to you, in all likelihood, especially if there are people around, they're probably not going to shoot you. They're just going to try to get away. They rely on you complying. So if you don't comply, like this 6-year-old girl, it's very possible that you get away. And it's like, okay, maybe you'll get shot, but maybe you'll live. And the alternative can be way worse. So the convictions keep coming. In 1975, he was charged and convicted of sexually abusing 2 girls. The authorities gave Klaus a psychological evaluation at this point, and the result of this was the determination that Klaus had an abnormal sexual instinct and was considered to be an addict of his sexual proclivities, I suppose. Meaning that they believed that he had a very hard time controlling himself. In 1976, Klaus was sentenced to time in a mental facility, and there he was chemically castrated in exchange for his release. Now, chemical castration at this time was considered very controversial, as it still is. And it's different than just like straight up castration, which is pretty barbaric. But chemical castration consisted of introducing non-steroidal estrogen to lower the offender's testosterone. And sometimes, and I think in most cases, they would have to introduce antipsychotic drugs, which would lower the person's or reduce their sexual urges. Because the castration part, it takes away their ability to reproduce, but it doesn't take away their sexual urges. So I actually don't really see what the point of it is, like, besides not allowing them to procreate. It's like basically just giving them a vasectomy. But it's like, okay, but you're still makes you a predator. So that is stupid. Also, the thing about chemical castration is that it's completely reversible, like a vasectomy. And they also offered Klaus no follow-up or monitoring to make sure that he was taking his additional medications to lower his sexual urges, which why would he do that? Which was so irresponsible. It's like almost unbelievable when you hear about what they did. Basically, they were like, hey, you're a sexual predator. If you want to get out of jail because we don't really want to keep you here, you can. We will chemically castrate you and give you some drugs. And he's like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And so he took that deal. And then only 2 years later, Klaus was able to get his castration reversed because you can reverse it. He went to a professional and he requested the hormone treatment to reverse it. And this was approved by the court. He claimed that he was having side effects from the original procedure, which I don't think was true. Plus, he now had a fiancée, and he told the court that he wanted to have children with her. And they were like, sure, go for it, man. That's fine. Like, good Lord, what the hell? And this was all done under the assumption that Klaus was receiving psychiatric treatment on a continual basis, which was not true. And which still would not have been enough. He is a child predator, you guys. Fuck. But Klaus had lied about being under the care of a mental health professional, and the urologist who was in charge of the procedure, who was in charge of making sure that this information was true, did not think it was necessary to follow up or check to make sure that this child sex offender was telling the truth. And obviously he wasn't. Like, what the hell, Germany? What the hell? Although I'm sure this was happening in other places besides Germany. But anyway, so I'm sure we can all see where this is going. And it's not shocking at all that a man like this would go on to murder young Anna. Now, a particularly enraging aspect of this crime was Klaus's version of events. Now, I'm going to tell you what he says happened, and it's slightly dramatized, but Klaus says that he never had any intention of molesting Anna. And he also denied touching her or assaulting her in any sexual way. His claim was that it was Anna who provoked him. Yes, he said that Anna wanted money from him and threatened him. He says that Anna said if he didn't give her money, that she would tell her mother that he molested her. And poor Klaus, he knew that accusations like this would get him thrown back in jail. This poor child sex offender stood at the mercy of this evil 7-year-old girl who was using all of her means and power to extort poor, innocent Klaus, the child predator and butcher. Klaus knew that he had to do something. He had to stand up to this maniacal 7-year-old girl who stood to rob him of everything he had in his child molesting life. He was simply left no choice. Anna had come over to Klaus's house with her demands, and she sat there in his home, in his chair, exacting her wicked plan upon poor Klaus, when suddenly he noticed a nearby hanging pair of stockings. Thinking fast, he grabbed the stockings, knowing his life was in mortal danger from the 7-year-old girl who sat there on his own chair mocking him. Klaus took those stockings and he strangled this little girl to death. Anna fought him with all of her 7-year-old girl's strength. It was a pretty even match, according to Klaus. The 7-year-old girl somehow produced the strength of a full-grown man to fight back, but after a long, even struggle, Klaus defeated Anna, saving the world from her blackmailing ways. Once it was over, Klaus felt remorseful. He put the little girl's body in a cardboard box, tied her up, and buried her in a bank of a nearby canal. That's basically what he said happened. I added a little bit of a dramatic effect, but that's basically what he said occurred. That she blackmailed him, that she threatened him, asking him for money, and there was nothing he could do but murder her. And he also said he didn't molest her, which I do not buy. Now, of course, nobody believed that story. And obviously, it's super pathetic that Klaus really thought that the police or the public would buy such a stupid story. He also told his fiancée when she came home exactly what happened. And she, thankfully, went right to the police. Now, what the police really believed happened went a little bit more like this. That day, Anna had skipped school, we know that, and she was out wandering about on her own, and she ran into Klaus. Now, Klaus and Anna knew of each other. They were neighbors, and he often let her play with his cat. They were friendly with each other. This was a known person to her, as it often is in these cases. On that day, she asked to play with Klaus's cat, and he said yeah, and he invited little Anna into his home. Now, his fiancée was normally home when something like this happened, but today she was out. I don't know what she was doing, but she was just out of the house. Maybe she was working like a normal person. And it is assumed, based on his history of molesting children and his reversed castration and not taking any of his antipsychotic medication, that he did sexually assault Anna. But he denies it, and often there's no evidence of sexual assault, depending on what type of sexual assault it is. We do know that he kept her in his apartment for multiple hours before strangling her to death with these pantyhose. So that's what we believe happened. Police went out and they retrieved little Anna's body from the bank of the canal where he left her. They found her inside of a cardboard box, bound with a rope in the way that a butcher might tie up a chicken. I don't know the technical term for that, but I just... So say they found her body and they didn't, like, they could have found her and then had to work backwards like a normal investigation where you find the body first. And I think if you were like a criminal profile and you found this crime scene, you would go, okay, this child is tied up. Ooh, they're kind of tied up a way that a butcher would tie up a chicken. We might be looking for a butcher. Sorry, I just thought of that, but I've been looking a lot into like criminal profiling and how it works, and there's been a couple cases where they found bodies and they did tie them. Like it's like a kind of a hog tie is what you call it. And the profilers have been like, it's possible that this person is a butcher or I don't know, any other job that does stuff like that. It's pretty specific, but that's like a clue that he would have left behind. Anyway, I think criminal profiling is fascinating. Anyway, so yes, they found her, and then the police went on to notify Marianne, of course. And she had kind of they say it was a weird reaction, but I think there's so many reactions one could have within the realm of normalcy that I don't think it's super weird what they say she was reacting like. But the police were definitely kind of put off by it. It was somewhat unusual, they said. Marianne didn't want to talk to them. She didn't want to identify the body. And it was like she completely shut down, which I don't think is that crazy because she's a single mom, right? And usually in these cases where a child is found murdered, like in the last case that we just did with the Grimes sisters, like it's usually they'll call in the dad and get him to identify the body. I wonder if maybe Christian did identify her. Anyway, Marianne felt extremely guilty, obviously, and this absolutely destroyed her. Remember, the last time she saw Anna, they were in a huge fight, and which is just awful. You hear all these stories about people who the last time they saw their dead loved one, it was in a fight, or they said, "I hate you," or whatever. And it's like, that must be just devastating, soul crushing. I can't even imagine. So important to just say, "I love you" every time you leave, and, try not to leave on bad terms because you never know. And then, Marianne kind of just went on to spiral from there. She went into a huge depression, unsurprisingly. She had a lot of rage. All of her friends and coworkers, they tried their best to support her, but I don't think they really understood how to. I mean, most of the people that she was surrounded by were like young students or like people who worked at a bar. Like these were not like people who knew how to deal with such an awful thing. I mean, nobody does, but... Anyway, it was just, she had outbursts all the time. Like, she was destroyed, completely understandably. And the trial did not make anything better. This did not help. The way Marianne was portrayed during this whole thing, both during the trial and in the media, was maybe somewhat accurate, but not super nice. I mean, they talked about, a lot of people judged her as a mother and her choices and yada yada, and it definitely hurt her and contributed to her extreme feelings of guilt. Now, Marianne attended the trial every day, and we'll see, the trial does not last very long. She was there every day. She sat in the front row. She often had outbursts during the trial, and she would yell at Klaus, calling him a pig or a liar. Again, completely understandable, not how you want to run a trial, but I get it. She was judged pretty harshly for this. Some people said that she was, that it seemed like she was kind of encouraging the drama and putting it on for attention. But I think it's also like, I just don't know how you can say that unless you've experienced that, because I don't know what parent in the world would be able to sit at a trial of somebody who raped and murdered your child and not have an emotional outburst every 5 seconds. Like, how would you do that? I would need to be tranquilized in order to do that, I'm sure. But anyway, Marianne sat and she listened to them describe the way that Anna's body was found and the way she was tied up and left there to rot. She could not stand it. And she was already suffering endlessly over her daughter's death, and having to relive everything in court was just beyond. And then there was some sort of misunderstanding. It was after the second day. Marianne somehow came to believe, based on overhearing a conversation, I think incorrectly, that Klaus was going to speak in court the following day. And Marianne believed that he was going to get up there and then tell his bullshit story about Anna blackmailing him. And she could not bear the thought of having to sit silently while he slandered her dead daughter. So that was after day 2. So day 3 took place on March 6th, 1981. And Marianne made her way to the courtroom like she had every other day, which wasn't full yet. And as people were taking their seats and the crowd was settling, Klaus was there seated at his defendant's spot or whatever. And remember, this is a time with much less security, much less separation. Marianne, she, checked out the situation, and then she very calmly walked up behind Klaus, who was seated in his defendant's spot, and she pulled out a .22 caliber Beretta and shot him 7 times in the back. She fired 8 times and only got him 7 times. Klaus slumped forward and pretty much died instantly. And Marianne dropped the gun. She did not resist arrest, and she was quoted as saying, quote, "I wanted to shoot him in the face. Unfortunately, I hit him in the back. I hope he's dead," end quote. This event was a huge shock to everybody at the trial and everyone in Germany and everybody internationally. But as soon as the dust settled, although it didn't settle, but as soon as, everyone took in what was happening, Marianne started to receive a bunch of support. She'd been arrested and brought into prison or jail or whatever, and she was receiving a lot of support. People applauded her. Strangers sent her cards and letters and flowers. Everybody thought, damn, that was justified. And people started raising money for her legal defense. Marianne became known as the revenge mother in the media. She was international news. She was a 32-year-old attractive woman, and people were calling her a hero. This was obviously huge. People love a crazy story about an attractive lady. That does well. Now, the legal situation for Marianne was another story. You see, because she shot Klaus before the trial had finished, in the eyes of the law, he was still an innocent man because he had not been proven guilty. So Marianne had shot just an innocent guy. And so Marianne had to be prosecuted. And I don't think that it would necessarily make a huge difference, but I wonder if it does make a difference in the court of law. I don't know, but he technically, he died an innocent man, which is kind of unfortunate. But yes, so she had to be prosecuted, and this is debatably understandable. You cannot let people get away with vigilante violence, or it kind of just creates more. That was the whole argument in John Q, where it was we can't just give the kid a heart, otherwise everyone's just going to go take hostages in a hospital until they get what they want medically. So as a lawmaker or as the court, that makes sense. You can't just give into vigilantism. On the other hand, the public was pretty into it. The public was pretty understanding as to why she did that. Marianne was initially released after her arrest to wait for her trial, but police at some point received information that led them to believe she would be a flight risk, so they took her back into custody where she awaited her trial. She sat behind bars for 15 months, and during this time, she was not at all cooperative. She attempted suicide 5 times, and she would not speak to the psychologists or mental health professionals. She just gave everyone a hard time, and eventually she was moved out of prison and into a psychiatric facility to finish waiting for her trial. as you can see, she was propped up as kind of a hero and whatever, but she was still experiencing a lot of mental health issues and trauma resulting from her daughter's death and now murdering somebody. So, and leading up to the trial too, people began, as they always do, to divide over the issue. She was a hero to many people. I think more people were kind of on her side and into the whole thing. But many people, again, would bring up her parenting style and accused her of being a neglectful mother. The bar that Marianne worked at, Tapasa, began to kind of be scrutinized, and many people felt like this was not the type of establishment that a child should have spent so much time in. And all of this was true, in my opinion, but I'm not sure what exactly it has to do with either murder. Like, even if you're not the best mom, like, it doesn't mean somebody can murder your child, and that's okay. And like, if you're a vigilante justice taker, like, does how good of a mom you are have to do with it? Like, either she's justified in killing this man or she's not. I don't understand what her lifestyle has to do with it, but obviously that people got into that will always happen, regardless of if it's logical or not. People were so interested in the trial that when it eventually came around in February of 1983, they had to move to another building so that they could accommodate everyone who wanted to be in the audience. The courtroom was totally full. There was a huge number of mothers in attendance, specifically who wanted to come and show support to Marianne. And the trial went on for 25 days. The prosecution was going for a first-degree murder charge, which was pretty bold, given the media situation. But before I tell you their arguments, I will give the defense strategy. So the defense said that the shooting was a spur-of-the-moment, emotionally induced reaction. They argued that the trial was so traumatizing for Marianne that it brought her to the breaking point where she simply snapped. They noted that Marianne was falsely under the impression that Klaus was going to get on the stand and continue to lie about her daughter, and she just could not take that. Her claim about the gun that she had was that after Anna had been killed, she bought the gun for self-defense reasons, and she claimed that she actually left it at Anna's gravesite, which I don't know why you would do if it was for self-defense reasons, but okay. And she said she never intended to use it on Klaus. And, this is kind of the gist of their side, that this was non-premeditated. The prosecution, though, had a lot of evidence for their claim of first-degree murder because, let's be honest, pretty sure this was first-degree murder. Do I blame her for it? No, but pretty sure that's what it was. They had evidence that Marianne had bought the gun from somebody who worked at Tapasa and that she had practiced shooting in the basement of the bar. There were bar patrons who testified to this, and despite Marianne claiming that she had kept the gun at Anna's grave and had never used it, and there was also the idea or the evidence that her shooting, like, she was a very good shot. She very accurately shot this man and really looked like she knew what she was doing. Like, the way she pulled it out was just like so swift and like so badass. But they were like, no, you obviously know how to use that gun. Don't pretend you didn't. Because she did. They tried to say, like, she'd never used it. She just had it for self-defense. It was clear she knew exactly what she was doing. And it was impressive. The prosecution also brought up Christian's comments from right after the shooting, which they were documented. And right after the shooting had occurred and he was there, he was quoted as saying, quote, "She did it. She actually did it," end quote. And so they argued that this comment was proof that Marianne had discussed the murder with him prior to this point, or probably threatened to do that, which heavily indicated that this was premeditated, or she at least had thought about it. Now, during her trial, Marianne testified in her own defense, and she testified that she shot Grabowski in a dream and that she saw visions of her daughter. I guess that was her, which kind of, again, goes to premeditation. But by the end of the trial, under huge public pressure, the prosecution ended up dropping the first-degree murder charge and instead went with manslaughter and unlawful possession of a gun, which Marianne was convicted of. She was given a 6-year sentence, and of those 6 years, she served 3, and she was released on parole in June of 1985. After all was said and done, I think Marianne had more supporters than detractors, which does not surprise me. Everyone was kind of arguing about, was this too much time? Was this not enough time? And that was like the big debate. I don't know. I think 6 years sounded pretty harsh, but I think, it's often the case in most cases, you get a sentence of 15 years and then it's not crazy for somebody to only do 3 to 5 or something based on whatever legal situation makes that. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. But everything that's written about her, even now, seems to be mostly praise. I think most people think it was pretty cool what she did. And I think that's because this woman had the balls to do something that so many people would love to do, which is publicly murder a child predator. Who doesn't want to kill a child predator, a convicted child predator, and soon to be would have been convicted child murderer? Then there's also still a divide, not over there is over the actual sentence, but a lot of people were kind of divided because they felt that Marianne kind of only got off on the murder charges because of the victim, that the fact that the victim was like a young child, girl specifically. And some argued that had the victim been a brother or a spouse or any sort of adult who was maybe less sympathetic, then she would have been treated much harsher. She would have been treated harsher, which kind of muddies the question of like, is murder? And should the victim matter? Should who the victim was matter when it comes to something like that? And I think that's definitely a fair critique. The question of whether something is legally justified versus morally justified has always been a hot topic for debate, and it's fascinating. And I don't know. So in some ways, I think like, yeah, who the victim is an aspect of this individual crime, and it's like things should be taken on an individual basis, at least morally. Legally, that's a whole different story, because you can't make laws or like sentencing structures based on individual cases. It makes things way, way too complicated. So it is a tough moral question or legal question or philosophical question. And I'm super curious if anybody has anything interesting to say on that, because I don't know. It sounds like if you're taking the legal, you have to be a little bit more conservative when you're thinking of it in a legal manner, because then you just open the door up to a lot of vigilantism, and vigilantism is good when it's like seems justified, but it can very quickly go in the other direction, and it's like, oops, I killed somebody who I thought murdered my child, but they weren't my child, or they weren't the murderer. So it gets shady real quick, and it's like easy for people to judge after the fact, or judge or like prop up a vigilante woman who was in this situation because you think, yeah, that's justified. But the lawmaker has a whole other thing to consider, which is like what the consequences for society will be. So it's a muddy question. It's a muddy idea, which is, the most fascinating questions you can ask. Personally, I do think this was a case of premeditated first-degree murder, but I also think that it was super badass, and I don't blame her for a second. And I would like to think that I would do the exact same thing if I were in her position and somebody murdered my child. I mean, are you kidding? Hopefully, I will just never be put in that position. So I'd love anyone's thoughts, because that's, the most interesting aspect of this story, obviously. Clearly, these days, we've done a lot to mitigate situations like this, which I think is, one of the best things I guess you can do if you're trying to prevent this type of thing. You know, we have much more secure courthouses. We've got metal detectors, security guards. Back when Marianne did this, there was no way of detecting a weapon. People could just walk in. There was no security, nobody checking your pockets, nothing. I went into a courthouse once because a friend of mine was called for jury duty. And it's like, you know, the scans, they're patting you down. They're like, you cannot bring a gun in there. There's no way. Which is how you know, keep people from doing that kind of thing, which makes sense. And like, you know, what are they called? The accused, the defendants are guarded. You often see, and when they're like walking to and from courthouses, they'll put them in bulletproof vests, and that, you know, makes sense. So the rest of Marianne's life. So Marianne and Christian, they later went on to file a lawsuit against Dr. Volker vom Ende, who was the urologist responsible for reversing Klaus's castration. This man had a lot to be responsible for, in my opinion. The story of his failure to look into Grabowski's history and fact check his lies, it all came out in court, or at least started to. And it did not look good for him at all. But Marianne and Christian, they attempted to sue him for negligence, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. And that was because they couldn't find an expert witness to testify against him. So he kind of just lucked out, because I think a lot of people, rightly so, blamed him. He should have been the like gatekeeper of that type of thing, and he failed. And I think also, like, the prison system failed. The system that said, hey, do you want a chemical castration and then you can leave, even though that's not going to take away your sexual urges, just take these pills, we'll trust you. Like, the fuck. Sorry. Anyway, so that was unsuccessful, unfortunately. Marianne ended up marrying a new man in 1985, which was the year that she was out. So I wonder if she met him while she was in prison. I bet she did. I bet she had a lot of suitors while she was in there. People love, yeah, that definitely happened. Anyway, they got together. They moved to Nigeria together. Interesting. But unfortunately, their marriage only lasted 5 years. And then when it ended, she moved to Sicily, Italy. There were 2 movies made about Marianne's story. One made by a German magazine who Marianne sold her story to, and this film was called Anna's Mutter. Anna's Mutter. In English, Anna's Mother. And the other movie was called The Bachmeier Case, No Time for Tears. I believe the clip from the beginning of this episode, the clip that kind of goes around quite a bit when you look up this case of her shooting Klaus, is from that movie. Neither film looks like they really hold up, to be honest. Here's a little clip from No Time for Tears, and you tell me. Some very stand-up performances there. In the early 90s, Marianne was back in the spotlight. She was interviewed on a German radio show in 1994. I couldn't really figure out, because obviously this is all in German, so it's hard to get translations, but that she, you know, kind of talked and was honest. And then in 1995, she appeared on a talk show called Fleige, Fleige. Please let me know how that's pronounced. And in that interview, she did admit that the murder was premeditated and that she did it to prevent Klaus from spreading lies about her daughter. There you go. Which was not a huge shock to anyone. I think everybody knew exactly what happened and why. And then on September 17th, 1996, Marianne actually died at age 46 of pancreatic cancer, which is a fucking bitch of a cancer, I'll tell you that. Not that I know from experience or anything, but I've heard it's an awful cancer. And so she, I think, you know, found out and then was terminal for a while and and that was pretty tragic. She was quite young and clearly lived a very traumatic life from pretty much start to finish. And Marianne recorded the last stages of her life. That she had contacted a reporter, an NDR reporter named Lucas Maria Bulmer, and he kind of documented the end stages of her life. And then she died, and she was buried next to Anna. And that is the story of Marianne Bachmeier and the death of Anna and the death of Klaus Grabowski and that giant situation. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I found that story absolutely fascinating. I was on Twitter and I saw this just like a picture and somebody writing a little blurb about it. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I could do like a short episode on that. I don't know. And then my good friend V, Head Knocker, she messaged me with the same story. I think she saw it somewhere and she was like, hey, you should do an episode on this. And I was like, yeah, I was thinking about it. And I started looking into it and I was like, yeah, there actually is quite a bit. There's enough for an entire episode here. Obviously the most interesting aspect is like legal versus moral culpability or whatever. And I just wonder what would happen in a situation like that if it occurred now. Obviously, you would never be able to say it was non-premeditated because you would have to go through a lot of planning. Sorry, my hair. You'd have to go through a lot of planning in order to make that happen. But stuff like that still does happen. I wonder if I could find any recent stories. And if you're in the mindset, John Q is on Netflix. Love that movie. Love Denzel. Love that guy. And that's it. I hope there's some interesting discussion about this. Maybe, oh yeah, I didn't plug my newsletter at the beginning, but my newsletter is, you can be found at grimweekly.com along with the archive of all my previous newsletters. Maybe I'll talk about some vigilantism in that this Friday. So stay tuned and please subscribe if you are here. That would be great. And stay safe because you never know who's knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Coe.